So I thought I'd start by talking a bit about some concepts and some sort of generalized facts about energy sectors, energy industries, and in relation to climate change, and then talk very, very briefly about the sort of global climate change negotiation dynamic, particularly because the latest round, the 26th round, in fact, COP26 starts today in Glasgow, as you probably know. I think it's been going for 7 hours by now. And so I can talk very briefly about, the lead up to Glasgow and what's at stake in Glasgow, and give my own kind of prediction or speculation or crystal ball gazing of what I think will happen in Glasgow. So as I said, let me start a bit with a few things about the energy sector. For the last few years, let's say 5 to 10 years, people have developed a concept called the energy transition in the energy sector. I mean, before that, nobody ever talked about energy transitions, but now it's sort of on everybody's lips, and every country, every government, every sort of academic, every commentator talks about the challenges of the energy transition. And what the energy transition means, of course, is transitioning from predominantly dirty energy, fossil fuels, to predominantly clean energy without greenhouse gas emissions, or particularly without carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions. And it's worth sort of understanding a little bit about why there's actually a concept. I mean, nobody would talk about a transition in the clothing industry or any sort of everyday product because it's not a difficult thing to transition most industries, but the energy industry is particularly difficult for a number of reasons. One of them is because energy assets usually live for a very long time. When you build a power plant, that can last 25, 30, 40 years. It can last technically. Whether it lasts economically is another question, but it can last technically. You can keep operating it. So you have an asset that can be earning you profit for a very long time. So you need some pretty strong incentives to abandon that asset, strand that asset, as they say technically, and switch to something else. And that's enormously problematic. It's also that energy assets tend to be linked to each other. They tend to be in networks, whether those networks are national electricity grids or international electricity grids, or even just sort of microgrids at the local level. There's a series of assets that are interlinked, and you can't do something to one, can't stop using one, for example, without affecting what you do to the others. So it makes decision-making particularly complex. The other concept that I want to introduce is the concept of a disruptive technology, which is a term, it has a very specific economic meaning. A disruptive technology is something where at first it's hardly used because it's too expensive, or it doesn't do what you want it to do. It doesn't have the features that you need. And then almost suddenly, or it always seems sudden, the cost of that technology gets much cheaper, either because of some technological breakthrough, or simply because it reaches a certain scale, and you get economies of scale that substantially reduce the costs. And suddenly something that was almost not used, or was almost nowhere, is everywhere, and it's being used by many, many people. And that's called a tipping point in a disruptive technology, when the economics of that technology changes so much, it becomes much more widely used. In energy, you can see that, for example, with solar energy, with photovoltaic panels, that used to be something incredibly expensive, and people only had them as a kind of symbolic act. Jimmy Carter, when he became president, covered the roof of the White House with solar panels that Ronald Reagan promptly removed later, because it was just a symbolic act. It had no economic benefit. Today, solar panels are much cheaper, and people do them for economic reasons. That's because it's past a tipping point, which it only passed in the last few years. So those are two interrelated important concepts: a disruptive technology and a tipping point. And let me talk a bit more about tipping points, because there's two levels of tipping point in energy systems, one of which is much more revolutionary than the other. So say, for example, you're comparing a coal-powered power plant and a solar-powered power plant. And let's say solar passes a tipping point, a price point, below which it's cheaper, when you're putting in a new power plant, it's cheaper to put in a solar power plant than a coal power plant. That's important for new investments, but it's not revolutionary, because you've still got thousands of coal power plants around the world that are still competitive, because you have a lot of sunk costs in the capital you invested. You'll only start abandoning those coal power plants when the solar power goes so much cheaper that it's worth abandoning the coal and putting in the solar. But then the solar has got to fall below an extremely low price point, and that's the second level of tipping point, where you start to get energy revolutions and energy transitions start to really speed up. And obviously, for climate change mitigation, moving from something that is carbon intensive like coal to something that has no carbon emissions like solar, it's incredibly important to be able to pass that second level of tipping point, where you start abandoning large numbers of coal power plants. But the thing to emphasize from all this is what it tells you about the role of markets compared to the role of government intervention. Because where you have assets that are very inflexible, take a very long time before tipping points are passed and they start to change, that really matters if what you're concerned about is climate change, if what you're concerned about is global warming. Simply because with global warming, timing is everything. I mean, it's not as if you can sort of warm up the planet and then just cool it down again later when it becomes more immediately competitive to replace your different types of power technology, because many aspects of climate change are obviously irreversible. So it really matters how quickly you achieve that change. And if the market is not achieving the change quickly enough, then there's a strong case for government intervention to make it act more quickly, because we don't have another planet to go through to put it at its bluntest. This has huge implications for economic policy and for energy policy. There are many things that many types of markets that you wouldn't want much government intervention in, that it wouldn't be very efficient. But energy networks, because of their climate change implications, are much more on the side of government intervention being something that's needed. And then it's really a question of how to do the government intervention and how to do it effectively. It also means, for the same reason, that the planning, that what we used to call central planning in the energy sector, is actually incredibly important. You may not want it very much in your economy as a whole, but in the energy sector, it may be really necessary. Let me talk a bit about a few specific energy technology issues that are relevant to the whole question of the energy transition. A few specific types of technologies, because they they tend to be really important for economic policy considerations. When we look at renewable energy, for example, the two main types that are getting really, really cheap are solar energy and wind energy. But unfortunately, the sun doesn't shine all the time, and maybe fortunately the wind doesn't blow all the time. So neither of those technologies are as continuous or dispatchable is the technical term, that you can use them, dispatch them all the time, as fossil fuel energy is. You know, if you're running coal power or power from natural gas, you can run it 24/7, 365, no problem. Solar and wind, with the best will in the world, you can't do that. So you have to find something to do in your power system that allows you to compensate for the variability of solar and wind. Whether you compensate it by using some sort of energy storage, batteries, for example, or thermal storage, or different storage technologies, or what some countries do is interconnect with neighboring countries that have different weather patterns from their own, so they can benefit from the complementarity of the different weather patterns. And then there are other techniques that you can use, but one way or another, the important thing is you have to do something along with the solar and the wind. You can't just sort of replace everything by solar and wind and you're done. Another technology to talk about is nuclear energy. So some people love nuclear energy because it's non-carbon, there's no CO2 emissions, and it can also be continuous. It's not like solar and wind. You can run nuclear energy all the time. Of course, there's the downside that, you know, when there are accidents, which there are quite a few examples from around the world, the accidents tend to be pretty catastrophic. Plus, nuclear energy is extremely expensive. Whatever, there are plenty of sort of nuclear energy lobbies who will try and convince us otherwise, but it's extremely expensive, particularly when you take into account that when you're finished using the nuclear plant, you have to do something with the spent nuclear fuel. You have to store it somewhere, and that has to be really carefully sealed and protected, and it's just very expensive. Increasingly controversial form of fossil fuel energy is using natural gas, burning natural gas to run power plants. It definitely has lower CO2 emissions than coal. So it's sort of popular as a kind of transition fuel when you're transitioning from coal to renewables, because you have to do all those other things along with renewables that I was talking about, like storage and so on. Some people argue for transitioning through natural gas because it reduces the CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour, or however you want to measure it. And then there are other people who are sort of strongly against that on the grounds that you know, a transition can be a transition for a very long time. Once you've built that power plant, you may stick with it for a few decades. And when you add it all up globally, you can still be creating a lot of CO2 emissions, even if it's less than it would have been if you did that with coal. It can still be too much for the planet. So natural gas, that used to be thought of as a very clean fuel, has now become an extremely controversial fuel for that reason. There are some people who argue that you can replace natural gas over time with green hydrogen. Okay, the green part means that you produce the hydrogen using renewable energy, solar or wind or hydropower, whatever. And the way you produce it is you use that electricity, that renewable electricity, to split water into hydrogen and oxygen as component parts, and then you can burn the hydrogen without any CO2 emissions. So if it's green to start with, and there are other colors of hydrogen that I won't go into, but if it's green to start with, meaning it comes from renewable electricity, it can be used as a much cleaner fuel than natural gas. And you can use it to, where you need heat, like making steel or chemical production or cement production, things like that, where you need a lot of very, very high temperature heat. This is the sort of dream fuel for quite a lot of people. Only problem is it's not nearly cheap enough as yet. So there's a whole big debate about what policy you would need, what economic policy you would need to bring green hydrogen from something expensive to something much cheaper. So those are the main kind of types of technology that I wanted to talk about. Let me come now to a little bit about the global climate change negotiation dynamic. So let's start from the beginning of the global framework, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. UNFCCC was signed by most countries in the world as far back as 1992. And when I was thinking about what I would say today, I thought back to 1992, which, as Janine said, is more or less the time that she and I first met and worked together. I'm wondering if at that time any of us, or let's say me, ever thought about climate change or ever thought about it as an economic development issue. And the answer is no. I don't remember. I'm not even sure I'd really heard of climate change back then, and certainly working in economic development in the World Bank, I didn't know anybody who was working on climate change and development, or even thought about it as a development issue, or thought about it as an issue for developing countries. It was something, if they thought about it at all, it was something that developed countries should deal with. Certainly when Janine and I were working in Armenia just after the breakup of the Soviet Union, if we'd ever mentioned climate change to our Armenian counterparts, they would probably have thought we were crazy. Now, you can't possibly work in economic development without thinking about climate change. It can be very controversial with many developing countries, but it's an issue that everybody needs to know a reasonable amount about, and we'll get into discussions of. So things have moved on a long way since then. So we now have the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow, and there's a few sort of previous COP negotiations. COP means Committee of Parties, meaning the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Since this is called 26, then obviously there's been quite a few rounds of negotiations before. But a couple of the key ones that came before. In 2009 in Copenhagen, there was a COP negotiation that was generally considered to be somewhat of a failure, that not much was agreed. But one thing that was agreed that we've been living with ever since, and that's particularly important for developing countries, is that the developed countries committed to provide $100 billion a year to developing countries to help developing countries deal with climate change, whether that was dealing with mitigating climate change, putting in place cleaner energy and cleaner transport systems and so on, or adapting to climate change, making investments to protect them from the effects of climate change, whether it's rising sea level or extreme weather or whatever. So they promised 100 billion a year starting from 2020, the last year. And that number is used as a sort of litmus test by developing countries of whether developed countries are in good faith, living up to their commitments. Now, it has to be said that the definition of what was in that 100 billion was left deliberately very vague, because otherwise they would never have been able to agree on a number. If they actually defined what it meant, what it covered, they wouldn't have been able to agree. And of course, 100 billion is a suspiciously round number. Why would it cost 100 billion? And some people say, oh, the 100 billion just covers money going from developed country governments to developing countries. Some people say, no, it's not just money from governments, it's also private sector money, private investment. And then you ask, well, actually, how can a developed country government promise that its private sector, whatever that means, its private sector will invest any specific amount in any other country? Isn't that just a private decision? Some people argue that it only refers to money that's subsidized, that's below market interest rates, that's concessional, as the terminology goes. Other people say, no, it covers all money. So it's because it wasn't defined, it's very, very easy to legitimately disagree on whether the developed world is actually providing 100 billion a year to the developing world. And different researchers have different methodologies for assessing that. And some people will tell you, oh, well, it's actually last year it was 80. And others will tell you, no, it was only 20. And they'll both be right because they've just chosen to use different definitions. So as you can imagine, it's an extremely contentious issue whether the developed world is providing that amount of money or not, which has a certain sort of slightly ridiculous element to it, because the cost of transitioning from a dirty energy system to a clean energy system, and the cost of transitioning from not being protected from the impacts of climate change to adapting to the impacts of climate change, is going to be trillions upon trillions of dollars. So why argue about that one particular financing element? But anyway, as I say, it's become a litmus test of whether developing countries think that developed countries are in good faith on this. So it's a politically extremely important number, even if economically it's not even clear what it means. So that was promised in 2009 in Copenhagen. In 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, which reiterates that promise of 100 billion. And the Paris Agreement is generally, the narrative is generally that it was a great success, that it set the framework for action. I think it has to be said that in reality, whether a particular round of negotiations, Copenhagen, Paris, Glasgow, or whatever, is a failure or success, is really a sort of collective narrative that develops. It's not a particularly objective thing. It's that people come away and they say, oh, that was great, we agreed on a lot, or they come away and say we didn't agree on a lot. But these negotiations are so fantastically complex and cover so many different things that you can't really summarize them objectively like that. But in any case, Copenhagen was generally seen as a failure, but the 100 billion emerged. Paris generally seen as a success. The last round of negotiations before this one now in Glasgow was in Madrid in 2019, widely considered to be a fiasco. No negotiations in 2020 because of the pandemic. And now we have Glasgow, where sort of hopes and expectations are extremely high because Madrid was a fiasco and 2020 was a non-year. But the sort of context in which Glasgow is taking place is pretty unfavorable to reaching an agreement on anything major for a number of reasons. One is, however you define the 100 billion a year, it hasn't been provided. The second sort of contextual reason is to do with the pandemic itself. You have a world that's increasingly divided into developed countries that have reasonably good access to COVID vaccines, and developing countries that have very bad access on the whole to COVID vaccines. And you have a world that's dividing into developed countries that have started recovering economically from the impact of COVID-19, and developing countries that really haven't. Developed countries that have undertaken huge fiscal stimulus packages and so on to get their economies moving again, and developing countries that mostly can't really afford to do that, or often they're very debt distressed and they can't borrow to do that. They don't have the domestic revenue to do it, and so on. So you have what some people are starting to call the great divergence between developed and developing countries. And when you go into negotiating about climate financing in the context of this feeling that the world is divided between North and South, the North having vaccines and economic recovery and the South not having those, it just sort of worsens the tensions between North and South, between developed and developing countries. So to give my sort of personal view on what's going to happen in Glasgow, I think it's going to be extremely difficult and pretty acrimonious between North and South, and I think it's unlikely to come out with much of an agreement. But I'm very cautiously optimistic about what happens after Glasgow, because I think Glasgow will be such a drama and will seem so disastrous that a lot of people in a lot of countries afterwards will be really desperate to kind of pick up the pieces and see what can be salvaged from the process. That's my optimistic part. So let me end on that sort of optimistic note, slightly optimistic note, and see, what you all think and what questions you have and what comments you have.
Okay, well, that's really interesting.
Thank you.
So questions? Kevin?
So I'm kind of going back earlier to one of the stories you brought up about the solar panels being installed under that administration, and that kind of being a show because there weren't economic benefits necessarily associated with it. In my mind, there's like still environmental benefits, and I was wondering if you thought the climate change, the battle, the need to actually do something about it, some of the strategies take a more environmental benefit approach and kind of ignore the market-based economic benefits approach, or if these upcoming negotiations are still going to mainly focus about the economic costs and benefits.
Okay, I'm afraid I could only half catch what you were saying. I don't know where the microphones are, so maybe Janine, I could hear perfectly. So maybe Janine, I don't know if you can repeat what the question was, or somebody else can repeat what the question was.
Sure, I think Molly will.
Yeah, do you want to, or maybe we'll let Cameron repeat?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me better now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so I guess my question was pretty much just if climate change and the need to actually implement strategies to combat it is ever going to get to the place where the negotiations stop kind of focusing on the environmental cost and the economic cost and the economic benefit, and then strictly focus on the environmental. And I guess that thought kind of came up from the solar panels being installed on the White House. and like that having no real economic benefit at the time, despite having like clear environmental benefits. So I was just wondering, like, from your perspective, if we're going to get to the point where we're like simply talking about the environmental benefit and like the cost of climate change.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a question that I often ask myself. So I wish I could give a really good answer to it. You know, given that we only have one planet, and it's on its way to becoming unlivable, you would kind of think that collectively people and governments would be prepared to pay an extremely high price to fix this problem. In other words, that they would be prepared to cover the cost of the environmental externalities. I mean, I'm never frankly sure whether saving the planet can be called an externality, but technically I suppose it is. Why it isn't that dirty energy, for example, is not so heavily taxed to avoid the negative externality of climate change. It's a very hard question to answer, but it certainly has a lot to do with how short-termist political systems are, right? And how every country believes in some way that it can free ride, that other countries might solve the problem without that country in question having to pay too much for the problem to be solved. So for example, you don't really see a huge difference in the degree of short-termism between democratic countries where governments have to sort of worry about getting voted out of office because they tax dirty energy too much. You don't see much difference really between those countries and other countries where governments don't particularly have to worry that they're going to get voted out of office. So although it has something to do with short-termism from voting, I think it mostly has to do with free riding between countries. There's just too many countries. Every country can think, even if it's a relatively large country, the US or China or whatever, every country can think, others are going to do a lot to solve this problem. So there are limits to how much we should pay to solve the problem. I mean, no country, no government ever really articulates it like that, but I think it's deeply implicit in the way that they think about climate change. So I don't know if you consider that an answer to your question, but that's my kind of attempt to answer why the question, why basically your question is, why hasn't this been solved already? Right? If it's so disastrous for our planet, why are people worrying about, the cost of this and that when the benefit is that we save the planet and the cost is that we don't?
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess I never really considered the free rider problem in a global nationwide context. So that was really interesting to hear. Thanks.
Okay.
Other questions? That's perfect. It's working. I think it's agreed.
Hello. Okay. Yeah, so I'm really interested in the renewable energy policy context in terms of the fact that, as you were saying, a lot of these renewable energy sources are becoming a lot more feasible and accessible economically, but considering that a lot of the communities that are most affected by the negative impacts of climate change, like air pollution, are also the ones that have the least amount of access to these renewable energy sources. What do you think are just some of the most effective policies to make sure that there's equitable access to these clean energy sources as they become more
Yeah.
possible, I guess.
Okay, so I think there's a number of different factors in there. One is something I was saying before about how most types of renewable energy are not 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow, and so on. So although solar and wind power are cheap, once you factor in the need for energy storage, for example, to take you through when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, then it's not so cheap anymore, because you've got to pay for that. And sometimes it won't be cheaper than the fossil fuel alternative. It depends an enormous amount on specific places and specific situations. Right? So that's one consideration. But in terms of policy, what that means is that if you want to increase the access to clean energy, then meaning you government, you need to find a way of subsidizing it. You need to find a way of subsidizing it that is not completely open-ended and that minimizes the amount of the subsidies. And a lot of people use auctions to do that, right? So you launch an auction where the providers of the technology or the providers of the electricity bid a price for providing that electricity, including they bid for a minimum subsidy, right? So whoever bids the lowest subsidy need wins the auction and gets the right to produce the electricity for that system. So there's various ways of implementing what people call smart subsidies, or let's say the cheapest subsidy you can get away with. So policies like that can be pretty effective, and they've proved effective in a lot of countries around the world. But it's important to design design what you're requesting through the auction as something that actually fits the system that you're adding it to. So if you need 24/7 electricity, then it's designed for that. If just daytime electricity when the sun is shining is fine, then you design it for that. Yeah, so I think that's my main answer to that question about policy.
I had a question regarding the COP negotiations coming up in Glasgow here. Since coming into office, President Biden has made climate action kind of a cornerstone of his administration's agenda. And a big part of that is entering back into these international climate negotiations. However, we're also coming off an administration that was openly very hostile to these kind of negotiations. How does that kind of whiplash between those two conflicting viewpoints reflect back on America in these negotiations? How does the international community view America right now, and how's that going to affect the negotiations going forward?
It's a really great question. So there's a number of ways in which it affects the credibility of the US in those negotiations. So, for example, when the US commits to a certain amount of financing to developing countries to undertake climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation, and it says, for the next X years, we will provide, so much per year. The rest of the world is looking at that and saying to itself, okay, you're promising that now as the Biden administration, but firstly, what's going to happen if Congress changes hands in the midterms next year? And secondly, what's going to happen if the White House changes hands in 2024, because the whole world is aware of the U.S. electoral timetable and what that can mean for U.S. government commitments on the various aspects of climate change. The commitment to reduce emissions over some time frame by a certain amount, which the U.S. has policies. The Biden administration has policies that quantify all that. People look at it and say, we kind of buy it through the end of next year. We maybe buy it through the end of 2024, but it's not really. We have to apply. Let's say we have to apply a heavy discount factor to beyond 2024. So it has an enormous impact on U.S. negotiations credibility. So when the U.S. is saying to China or Russia or India or Brazil or anybody, we're making such and such an effort on emissions reductions, you need to make an equivalent effort. Nobody is going to turn around, no government is going to turn around openly to the US and say, that's really not worth much because you've got no guarantee that you're going to be there for very long, but they'll think it and they'll make their decisions based on that. There's no way around that fact. So what the Trump administration did in withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, because that's the specific step that they took, apart from not having climate policies and not believing in climate change and so on, they withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and Biden took the US back into the Paris Agreement. Everybody knows that it's all reversible for domestic US political reasons. So that's a kind of depressing answer, but I think it's a depressing situation. I think the US, in fact, has really very little negotiations clout in the climate change space because of that.
Hey, so I wanted to ask a question about what you sort of see as the role of nuclear energy moving forward, because as we talked about, it has some downsides in the accidents and the high cost, but I'm curious how you and other countries sort of perceive those costs relative to the benefits, because it can produce a consistent source of energy over a long period of time. So I am just sort of curious about how we would weigh those trade-offs.
So, firstly, I think there are many countries that simply don't have the institutional capacity to implement nuclear power, right? Because it requires a kind of critical mass of technical skills that can take years to build. I mean, even people in the nuclear power industry will tell you, if a country's starting from scratch, if it's never done nuclear power and just doesn't have the trained and qualified staff, it'll take 15 years to build up the critical mass to have that staff. So there's a lot of countries where it just isn't really feasible at least in the near term. Another thing about nuclear power is that, well, let me put it this way. So, as I was saying, when you talk about solar and wind, if you're talking about the total cost to the electricity system of adding solar and wind, you have to look at the cost also of providing energy storage or other techniques to compensate for the fact that the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So the system cost is higher than let's say the project cost, the individual investment cost. In a way, the same for sort of reverse of that reason, the same is true for nuclear, because nuclear happens to be a technology that you can't, you either run it at its maximum capacity or you don't run it. For just engineering reasons, you can't go up and down a lot, right? So if the demand for electricity on your system is going up and down a lot, or the supply of other types of electricity is going up and down a lot, you can't use nuclear to sort of compensate for that. You've just got to run it at a high level, which in effect means that if you have a lot of nuclear on your system, it's really difficult to have a lot of solar and wind on your system at the same time, because when you have solar and wind on the system, you want the other things to go up and down as the sort of, you know, sun shines and doesn't shine, and the wind blows and doesn't blow. So that, in a system sense, that makes nuclear even more expensive because it's crowding out cheap solar and cheap wind. And I think as more and more countries realize that cost, as well as the environmental risk of nuclear and so on, as they realize that cost, they're going to be less and less likely to put nuclear on their systems, because in systems terms it's just really expensive. But you know, this is an area where policy making is far from innocent and neutral. There's a very strong industrial lobby for nuclear that works on, you know, any government it can influence, it will try and influence, because there's a huge amount of money at stake, because you never do a little nuclear project. You can't do small nuclear power plants, not really small. It's always something huge. And so the money involved for each nuclear power plant, you're talking billions of dollars. And billions of dollars brings forward a lot of lobbying. So it's if what you're asking is how will countries actually make up their minds and make policy, that's really hard to predict, because it's not going to be just on the basis of economics. I mean, not that anything ever really is, but it's even less so because of all the influence involved. So I personally hope that not many countries increase their use of nuclear, but if you're asking me, do I predict whether they will or not, that's kind of a different question, because that depends on the lobbying and the politics of it.
Oh, I think you were already somewhat touching on this with your comments about lobbying, but I wanted to know a little bit more about your take on influence from the private sector and how the private sector plays a role in climate action or climate solutions, just in terms of obvious negatives that go on when incentives between the private sector and the public sector are misaligned, but also from another way of looking at it, the private sector might be the only ones who can provide a service that a current government can't provide. So I just wanted to know a little bit about like the biggest pros and cons that people in this industry consider when thinking about the private sector.
Yeah, okay. So I think the biggest pro for the private sector is that when complex technology choices need to be made, and they very often do in the energy sector, the private sector is usually, and I stress the word usually, is usually much better at making complex technology choices than the public sector is. Because generally the private sector has wider experience with different technologies than any specific government does, particularly when you're introducing a technology for the first time in a country, or maybe you've done it a little bit, but you haven't done it very much. Then the government of that country, by definition, has no direct experience or very little direct experience of that technology and what and what it really costs to buy and to run. And the private sector is in this industry is often international and is operating in a number of different countries, and so they have a wider experience of how technologies function, energy technologies function, than any specific government does. So I think when it comes to technology choice and sort of cost minimization around technology choice, the private sector is pretty important to involve the private sector. Governments can make really bad mistakes about technology just through lack of experience, and often it's a matter of experience. It's not a thing where you can just go away and read a lot of stuff and then you know what you need to know. Because with energy technologies, either the experience is recent and not really written up, or more importantly, the technology and knowledge has intellectual property rights around it, so you can't really find out everything you need to know about a technology if you don't own that technology. So that's that sort of information asymmetry problem is a very real problem. So I think the private sector is incredibly important for technology. I think on the other hand, when what really matters is taking a very long-term view of energy transitions, governments tend, with all the caveats I mentioned earlier, that governments tend to be better at taking a long-term view than the private sector does, and that can be pretty important. Governments tend to be better at taking whole power system views than the private sector does. The private sector generally looks at individual assets. It's really hard to generalize about these things, but trying to find some sort of criteria, some principles to differentiate between the two. My other observation is that as sort of economists or public policy makers, we have a bias towards thinking that private capital is incredibly mobile and moves very easily and very quickly between different investments, different types of technologies, different sectors, and so on. But my observation of the energy sector, and I mean, I've even worked briefly in the private sector in energy in a multinational oil company. Their capital can be incredibly inflexible and immobile for reasons that one can come up with explanations, but it's hard to actually come up with a really kind of fully convincing, comprehensive explanation. But as an observation, oil companies, for example, it's hard to get them off oil. You'd think, with billions and billions in capital, that capital would just go where, the future looks most promising. But on the other hand, oil companies are stuffed full of people who know about oil and not much else. They're petroleum geologists or petroleum engineers, and that's not easily transferable to being some other type of engineer. So the private sector can be as much part of the problem as part of the solution. Plus, it's often really hard to see from outside whether they are transforming themselves or not. I mean, they can talk a very good game about going green and going climate change conscious, and having net zero emissions by 2050 or whatever, because they know that the public and a lot of their shareholders want to hear that. But at the same time, there's the ability to kind of greenwash is pretty huge. So it's actually really hard to know how much the private sector is changing in direction and how much it's pretending to change.
I think we have time for one more question. Is that Andrea?
Hi, thank you for speaking with us, first of all. I was curious about something related to green hydrogen. I know a lot of developing and developed countries alike are investing a lot in research and development on it. And I'm wondering, as we think about renewable energy as not just like electricity sources, but also renewable fuel sources, do you see, in your professional opinion, that green hydrogen could potentially be one of those kind of like disruptive technologies you were talking about earlier? Or do you think we're gonna end up kind of having to stick more with traditional renewable energy sources?
Yeah, I think if I could really predict the answer to that, I could be enormously rich. But every country I know has some sort of green hydrogen strategy or policy, or its leaders have made supportive statements or whatever. I think at this stage it depends enormously on whether some countries or groups of countries like the European Union implement support policies, particularly subsidy policies, that scale up the technology such that it becomes much cheaper, and then green hydrogen becomes something that's actually competitive. The main part of the technology that needs to be scaled up is not the renewable electricity that you put in to split the water into green hydrogen and oxygen. It's the electrolyzer that you use to do that water splitting. You put the renewable electricity into an electrolyzer, and electrolyzers are not currently globally produced on a huge scale, so they're pretty expensive. There are many people who've sort of done the analysis of how would scale production of electrolyzers affect the cost of electrolyzers and therefore affect the cost of green hydrogen. And that analysis is pretty supported, pretty positive. So if some countries put those policies in place to scale up the use of green hydrogen, and that scales up the production of electrolyzers, that brings down the cost for everybody, because the electrolyzers are going to be, globally tradable. So you don't need every country to put in place the subsidy policy, but you need some. And I would say the most likely is that the European Union will do this, because they're probably the most advanced in their policy analysis of what's needed. And the next most likely is possibly the Gulf and countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and so on, because they have such huge renewable electricity potential for extremely cheap solar and, well, wind to some extent, but mostly solar. But as yet, those policies are not in place. So until they're in place, I think it's really impossible to predict how quickly green hydrogen can sort of take off and become disruptive. But it is enormously important, because there are industries like, as I mentioned, steel and cement and chemicals and so on, where using electricity directly for the heat, the very high temperature heat that's needed in the industrial process, is very hard and very expensive. And having something like green hydrogen that you can get to a higher temperature by burning it could make a big difference. I think also for sort of heavy transport, there's heavy types of transport, trucks and trains and ships and so on, where trying to power them with electricity is just too hard. The power that you need is just too great. Those are cases where green hydrogen could make a difference. Not probably for lighter vehicles, cars and buses and so on. That's more likely to be electrified. But But there are some segments, some sectors where green hydrogen would be a revolutionary way of reducing or even eliminating pretty substantial CO2 emissions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, and this has been fascinating. So, oh, you can't quite see me, but it's been really interesting, and it's a great introduction. We're about to start really discussing climate change in the class.
Okay,
So this is a great start, and especially timely given that the negotiations start today. So thanks so much. Let's thank Jonathan Lawson.